I died believing the man standing over me was my murderer. When I opened my eyes again, I was wearing his face. The woman crying over my grave was living inside my body. Everyone wanted me executed. Everyone believed she was the innocent victim. To survive, I had to become the monster history already hated. But the cruelest truth was still waiting. The man who killed me had never been the real villain. Death, Qingran had always imagined, would be quiet. A closing door. A held breath that never released. She had pictured it 100 times in the months she spent chasing men who could make people disappear, pictured it the way a person pictures a storm they've been warned about but never quite believe will reach their street. It was not quiet. It was fluorescent light burning white behind her eyelids, a machine beeping impatient, mechanical rhythm, and the sting of an A4 line taped crookedly into the back of a hand that did not feel like her own. She thought, this isn't supposed to happen. Heaven doesn't have monitors that beep. Then she opened her eyes, and heaven made even less sense than that. The ceiling above her was the flat acoustic tile of a hospital room, water-stained in one corner in the shape of a country she didn't recognize. Sunlight came in thin and gray through a blind that hadn't been dusted in a while. Her wrists, she noticed this before she noticed anything else, because the metal was cold and unmistakable, were cuffed to the bed rails. Cuffed. She was Qingran. She wrote about corruption for a living, not the kind of person you shackled to a hospital bed. She opened her mouth to say so, to demand an explanation, and a voice came out that had never belonged to her. Low. Rough at the edges, like gravel dragged over stone. A man's voice. She went rigid. Outside the door, muffled through glass, 2 police officers stood with their arms crossed, throwing glances into the room every few seconds the way you'd watch a caged animal you weren't sure was properly sedated. A nurse hurried past, clipboard hugged to her chest, and said to someone Qingran couldn't see, "The patient is awake. Get Dr. Meng." The patient. Not her name. She waited for someone, anyone, to say Qingran, to acknowledge that the woman lying broken and cuffed to this bed was a journalist who had, only hours ago by her internal clock, been standing in an abandoned warehouse trying to expose the largest fraud case the city had seen in a decade. Instead, the door opened, and a doctor she'd never met looked down at her with the particular caution reserved for dangerous men, and said, "Mr. Gu. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Mr. Gu." Qingran laughed. It came out wrong, deeper, sharper, not her laugh at all, and the sound of it frightened her more than the cuffs had. "That's not funny," she said, except the voice that said it belonged to someone else, and the doctor's expression didn't so much as flicker, because to him, of course, nothing strange had happened. To him, Gu Yichen had simply woken up. Gu Yichen. The name detonated something in her chest. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name, cold, dangerous, the security director for Helios Consortium who had threatened her more than once to stop digging, whose face had been the last thing she'd seen before. She turned her head, desperate and disbelieving, toward the black rectangle of the darkened window, and the city outside gave her nothing back but her own reflection. Except it wasn't her own. A man's face stared back at her from the glass, sharp jaw shadowed with 2 days of stubble, a thin white line of a scar through one eyebrow, dark eyes that had, in every photograph she'd ever seen of them, looked like they belonged to someone incapable of mercy. Gu Yichen's face. Moving when she moved. Blinking when she blinked. Opening its mouth in a silent, horrified shape when she tried to scream. The man who killed me, she thought, staring at herself, is the face I'm wearing now. Her mind reeled backward, grasping for the last clear memory she had, and the room around her seemed to thin and fall away as the memory pulled her under. Who she had been. Before any of it, before the warehouse, before the cuffs, before waking in a stranger's ruined body, Qingran had simply been a woman who could not leave a contradiction alone. She'd learned the habit young, from a father who ran a small hardware shop and taught her, without ever quite meaning to, that most people telling a lie left a seam somewhere if you looked closely enough. She carried that habit through a journalism degree she nearly abandoned twice for lack of money, through 4 years at a mid-sized paper covering city council meetings no one else wanted, through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of trust from sources who had learned she would rather sit on a story for months than get a single fact wrong. She had never set out to become the reporter who brought down corporate empires. She had simply followed one loose thread, an anonymous tip about a warehouse fire that insurance records didn't quite explain, until it led her, for months and a dozen dead ends later, to the edge of something far larger than she'd ever expected to find. She had known, even then, that she was circling something dangerous. She had simply never imagined, in all her careful contingency planning, that the danger would end with her waking up inside the body of the man she'd spent months publicly accusing of being its architect. She had spent 4 months building the case against Helios Consortium, 4 months of anonymous tips, shell companies traced through 3 countries, a whistleblower who wouldn't meet her in daylight. Every thread led to the same place, a warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, where witnesses said trucks came at night carrying crates that were never logged anywhere official. Gu Yichen had warned her off twice. The first time, he'd simply appeared outside her apartment building, arms crossed, and told her to drop it, that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. She'd recorded the conversation and used it as proof of intimidation in her next article. The second time, he'd cornered her outside the newspaper's parking garage, closer, angrier, his voice low and urgent in a way she mistook, she realized now, with the sick clarity of hindsight, for threat instead of warning. "You don't understand what you're circling," he'd said. "Stop before it stops you." She hadn't listened. She'd gone to the warehouse instead, certain she had finally cornered the man responsible for the whole rotten structure. It was a trap. Not hers, his. Or so she believed in the last conscious seconds of her old life. The warehouse had been darker than she expected, the air thick with rust and diesel. She remembered the particular quality of the silence just before the gunmen emerged from the shadows along the catwalks above, 3, maybe 4 of them, faces covered, weapons already raised. And Gui Chen had stepped in front of her. She hadn't understood it then. She barely understood it now. He'd shoved her sideways as the first shot cracked through the dark, taken the impact meant for her shoulder into his own, snarled something she couldn't hear over the second and third shots. She remembered thinking, absurdly, why is the villain protecting me, and then an explosion somewhere behind the crates threw them apart in a wave of heat and smoke. When the smoke cleared enough to see, a masked figure on the upper catwalk had a rifle trained down at her. She remembered the sound before she understood what it meant, a single shot, flat and final, and then heat blooming through her chest like something had reached inside her and closed a fist. She remembered falling. She remembered Gui Chen's face, that same face she was now trapped behind, appearing above her, blood on his hands, his mouth moving in words she couldn't catch through the ringing in her ears. She remembered thinking, with the strange calm of a mind shutting down, he's going to finish it. She remembered a pinch at her throat, sharp and cold, like a needle. She remembered darkness. And she remembered being certain as she had ever been of anything, that Gui Chen had killed her. The memory released her, and she came back to herself gasping in a stranger's throat, in a stranger's ruined body, cuffed to a bed while a doctor asked Gui Chen's face questions Gui Chen's face could not answer. "Do you remember what happened to you?" the doctor pressed. "You were brought in with severe trauma. We weren't certain you'd wake up at all." She didn't answer. She was staring past him, past the 2 officers now standing in the doorway, at the small television mounted in the corner of the room, muted, tuned to the evening news. And there, beneath a red banner reading tribute, the journalist who exposed Helios, was Su Qingran's face. Her own face. Smiling faintly in a photograph clearly taken from her staff profile. Beneath it, a caption scrolled, "Investigative reporter Su Qingran, 27, confirmed dead following warehouse incident linked to ongoing Helios Consortium investigation. Suspect Gui Chen apprehended at the scene." They thought she was dead. They thought the man whose body she now occupied had killed her. And she was staring at her own funeral being prepared on national television while trapped inside the face of the man the world believed was her murderer. "Who's inside my body?" she whispered, Gui Chen's low voice cracking around the words like it didn't know how to hold that particular kind of fear. The doctor frowned, mistaking the question for delirium, and reached for her chart. Su Qingran didn't correct him. She couldn't. She could only stare at the muted television as the segment cut to a new image, her own face again, but moving now, alive, dabbing at unconvincing tears outside what she recognized, with a lurch of vertigo, as her parents' front door. The caption beneath the new image read, "Su Qingran's closest friend, Xinruoshi, comforts grieving family." Except the woman on the screen wasn't comforting anyone. She was smiling. They let Detective Han Zixuan into the room 2 hours later, once the doctors had finished their tests and pronounced Gui Chen, fit enough to be questioned, if not fit enough to be uncuffed. He was younger than she'd expected from the grainy photograph in one of her own old articles, with the tired, careful eyes of a man who had learned early in his career not to trust first impressions and had spent every year since disciplining himself to remember it. He pulled a plastic chair to the bedside without asking permission and sat with a slim folder unopened on his knee, studying Gui Chen's face, with an intensity that made her want to look away and disappear into the pillow. "You're a hard man to kill, Mr. Gu," he said finally. "For bullet wounds, 3rd-degree burns on your left side, and a head trauma the ER doctors thought would put you in a coma for a week. Yet here you are. Awake. Talking." He tapped the folder against his knee. "Some people would call that lucky." She said nothing. She had learned, in only a few hours of being Gui Chen, that saying nothing was often the safest choice a person in this position could make. "I'll tell you what I think happened," Han Zixuan continued, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I think you lured Su Qingran to that warehouse to stop her digging into Helios Consortium permanently. I think something went wrong, maybe she fought back, maybe your own people turned on you when the job got messy, and you ended up nearly as dead as she is. I think if she'd lived, she would have named you. And I think that's exactly why you can't quite look at me right now. Every word landed like a blow, not because it was true, but because Su Qingran understood, with a sick twist of recognition, precisely how convincing it must have sounded to anyone who hadn't seen what she had seen in the warehouse's final seconds. She had believed a version of this exact story herself, right up until she woke up wearing the face of the man it accused. "I didn't kill her," she said. The words came out low, steady, Guichen's voice, but her own conviction underneath it, and for one unsettling moment she thought she felt something else move behind her ribs too, some borrowed instinct that recognized the shape of the lie being told about him and rejected it before she consciously chose to. Han Zishuan's eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging the denial the way he'd clearly cataloged 100 others before it. "Everyone says that." "I know," she said, and meant it more than he could possibly understand. He studied her a moment longer, then rose, tucking the unopened folder under his arm. "You're not going anywhere far, Mr. Gu. I'd get comfortable with that idea." At the door, he paused, glancing back at the muted television still playing its loop of Su Qingran's photograph. "She was good, you know. Whatever you think you were protecting by silencing her, she was better at this than almost anyone I've worked a case with. It's a waste." He left before she could find any way to answer that didn't risk giving away exactly how much she agreed with him. The warehouse continued. Alone again, the room quiet except for the machines, she let the memory pull her under a second time, deeper now, chasing details she'd been too frightened to examine on the first pass. She remembered the specific texture of the warehouse floor, concrete gone soft and pitted with age, littered with the husks of crates long emptied of whatever they'd once carried. She remembered the particular cold of the air that night, damp with the threat of rain that never came. She remembered, most of all, the sound of Guichen's voice the second time he'd cornered her outside the parking garage, 3 days before everything ended. "You think you're chasing a story," he'd said, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face even in the garage's poor light. "You're chasing a grave. Mine, if I'm lucky. Yours, if I'm not." "Is that a threat?" she demanded, already reaching for her phone to record it. "It's the only warning I'm allowed to give you," he'd said, and something in his voice, something she had dismissed then as menace and understood now, replaying it with new eyes, as something closer to grief, had made her hesitate for exactly as long as it took him to turn and walk away. She hadn't listened. She had published the recording 2 days later as proof of intimidation, and 3 days after that, she had walked into the warehouse anyway, certain she had finally cornered a killer. She had been half right. There had been a killer waiting for her in that warehouse. It simply hadn't been the man she'd blamed. They released Guichen's body from the hospital 4 days later, into a city that hated him and a life Su Qingran had no idea how to live. The apartment was enormous and cold, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, furniture so minimal it looked staged for a magazine rather than lived in. She stood in the middle of it the first night, still wearing a stranger's height and a stranger's shoulders, and understood for the first time just how alone Guichen had always seemed in every photograph anyone had ever taken of him. She had 2 problems, and they were the same problem wearing different faces. The first was survival. Detective Han Zishuan had made it clear, in a visit to the hospital that left her hands shaking under the blanket, that Guichen remained the prime suspect in Su Qingran's death, and that he would be watched closely. One wrong move, one flicker of behavior that didn't match the cold, controlled man the department had built a case file around, and she would be arrested for a murder she hadn't committed, in a body that wasn't hers, defending a life she didn't understand. So she learned to be him. She practiced his silences in the bathroom mirror, the flat, unreadable stare that made people look away first. She learned, from the careful, frightened way his housekeeper spoke to her, that Guichen rarely raised his voice and never had to, that fear had done the talking for him for years. It disgusted her to wear that fear like a coat. It also, increasingly, kept her alive. The second problem was worse. The second problem had her face. She found herself, on the 5th night, standing across the street from her parents' apartment with a coat collar pulled high and a cap low over unfamiliar hair, watching lamplight move behind curtains she'd grown up staring out of. She watched her mother's silhouette cross the window. She watched a second silhouette join her, smaller, familiar in its posture in a way that made something twist violently behind Su Qingran's borrowed ribs. Shin Ruashi. Her closest friend since university. The person who had sat with her through 3 heartbreaks, 2 job losses, and 1 terrifying diagnosis that had turned out, thankfully, to be nothing. The person who was, right now, living inside Su Qingran's body, drinking tea. In Su Qingran's mother's kitchen, being held and comforted as though she were the one who had lost someone, rather than the one who had taken everything. It should have been a relief, she told herself later, lying awake in Guichen's enormous cold bed. If Shinruashi's consciousness had ended up in her body, then somewhere, some scrap of Su Qingran's own soul might still exist too, displaced, but not erased. It should have felt like hope. It felt like watching a stranger wear her skin to her own funeral. She began to notice, over the following 2 weeks, how effortlessly Shinruashi settled into the role. Not grief-stricken. Not disoriented, the way Su Qingran herself had been disoriented waking up somewhere impossible. Comfortable. Shinrawashi gave a brief, composed statement to a morning show about honoring her friend's legacy that used, word for word, phrases Su Qingran recognized from her own private journal, a journal she had never shown anyone, kept in a drawer in her old apartment that Shinrawashi now, apparently, had full access to. Co-workers at the paper mourned Su Qingran and trusted the woman standing at her desk without a flicker of suspicion. Her editor patted Shinrawashi's shoulder, her own shoulder, Su Qingran thought, watching from across the street with binoculars she'd found in Gui Chen's closet, wondering distantly why a security director owned surveillance equipment at all, and said something that made Shinrawashi's borrowed face arrange itself into an expression of humble grief that Su Qingran had never once made in her life. It was flawless. It was too flawless. And it sent her looking for evidence in the one place she hadn't yet dared to search, Gui Chen's own apartment, room by room, drawer by drawer, certain she would find whatever proof of guilt the police believed existed. She found something else entirely. Behind a false panel in his home office, beneath a floor safe she cracked only after 3 days of trial and desperate error, she found a cache of encrypted hard drives, surveillance photographs, and printed financial records, years of them, meticulously organized, tracing shell company after shell company back to a single source. Helios Consortium. The exact structure she had spent 4 months trying to map from the outside, already fully mapped from the inside, in handwriting she now recognized, with a chill, as Gui Chen's own. He hadn't been protecting Helios. He had been building a case against it. The final folder stopped her cold. Photographs, dozens of them, taken from a distance, over what must have been months, all of the same subject. Su Qingran, walking to work. Su Qingran, meeting a source in a coffee shop. Su Qingran, standing at her apartment window at night, unaware she was being watched. Not the photographs of a stalker. The photographs of someone keeping a careful, quiet, unacknowledged watch over a person he expected, at any moment, to be in danger. She was still staring at them, hands trembling in a stranger's grip, when a secure phone she hadn't known existed buzzed once on the desk beside her. One message. No name attached. You're alive. Don't trust the woman wearing Su Qingran's face. Before the message arrived, before the floor safe and the false panel, there had been 10 days of simply learning to survive as him, and those 10 days had taught her almost as much about Gui Chen as the files eventually would. His housekeeper, an older woman named Auntie Wei who had worked for the Gu family since before the accidents that took them, arrived on the third morning with groceries and a wariness that broke Su Qingran's heart before she understood why. Auntie Wei set the bags down without a word, moved through the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of long habit, and only spoke once, quietly, near the door on her way out. You look tired, young Master Gu, she said, not quite meeting her eyes. You always do, after. Su Qingran turned the word over for hours, until she found the pattern in his files, 6 years of quiet disappearances timed to align, always, with some new piece of evidence against Helios, some fresh grief revisited. Auntie Wei had been watching a man work himself toward destruction for years and had never once been trusted with the reason why. She learned his silences were a kind of language. When she said too much to a courier who arrived with an unmarked package, thanked him, asked after his day, the ordinary decency that came as naturally to her as breathing, the man's face had gone carefully blank with confusion, and she had understood, too late, that Gui Chen did not thank couriers. Gui Chen barely acknowledged that couriers were people at all, not out of cruelty, she came to realize, but because kindness was a currency he could no longer afford to spend where anyone might notice and use it against him. She practiced in mirrors at night, the flat stare, the stillness, the way he held a room's attention simply by refusing to fill its silences the way other people instinctively did. It felt, each time, like putting on a costume stitched from someone else's scar tissue. The test came on the 8th day, when a summons arrived from Helios Consortium's board, an emergency session convened to address concerns about Director Gu's continued fitness for his role in the wake of a murder investigation. She sat in a chair across a table from 9 executives who had known Gui Chen for years, any one of whom might notice a hesitation, a wrong word, a gesture that didn't match the man they thought they were addressing. The board has concerns, said the chairman pro tem, a thin, silver-haired man named Director Kai, about your continued presence at Helios given the circumstances. She let the silence stretch exactly as long as she'd practiced. The circumstances, she said finally, in Gui Chen's flattest register, are that a journalist is dead and I am the only person in this room who has spent 6 years actually protecting this company's interests instead of merely profiting from them. It was reckless. It was also, she realized as she said it, closer to true than anything she'd expected herself to say. Around the table, several executives exchanged glances she couldn't fully read, not suspicion at an imposter, but something more like old, careful tension between people who had learned to be afraid of the same man for reasons they'd never voiced aloud. Only Lu Qinghan's proxy on the board, a smooth younger man named Deputy Director Fong, smiled thinly and said nothing at all, watching her with an attention that made the hair rise on the back of her borrowed neck. She left the meeting with her authority intact and her nerves in ruins, and understood, driving back through the city in Gui Chen's black car, that she had just successfully impersonated a man everyone in that room feared, and that the fear itself might be the only shield keeping her alive long enough to find out why. The first time a stranger recognized Gui Chen's face in public, Su Qingran nearly gave herself away entirely. She had gone out, carelessly, she'd admit later, for coffee 2 blocks from the apartment, cap low, collar high, telling herself a security director's face was recognizable mostly from grainy news photographs and unlikely to be spotted in the flesh by anyone paying attention to their own life instead of the headlines. She was wrong. A young man at the next table glanced up from his phone, did a visible double take, and had his own phone raised and photographing before she'd even registered what was happening. "That's him," she heard him whisper to his companion, too loudly, phone camera clicking. "That's the guy from the Qingran case." She was out the door before the barista called her order, heart hammering in a stranger's chest, cutting through an alley she remembered from Gui Chen's files as a route his own security training would have favored, narrow, camera-blind, opening onto a parallel street 3 blocks from where she'd left the car. She didn't stop moving until she was certain no one had followed, and sat afterward in the driver's seat with her hands, his hands, shaking too hard to fit the key into the ignition for nearly a full minute. It was, she understood later, the moment the danger of her situation stopped feeling theoretical. Somewhere online, within the hour, a blurry photograph of Gui Chen buying coffee 3 blocks from his own apartment would circulate under captions calling him a fugitive, a killer. A man who dared to walk free while his supposed victim's memorial service was still being planned. She would read the comments later, unable to stop herself, and find in them a version of her own old certainty, the same righteous, uninformed fury she herself had once brought to every article she'd written about him, and feel, for the first time, what it actually cost a person to be that thoroughly, publicly misunderstood. She did not leave the apartment again for 11 days after that, and when she finally did, it was only ever after dark, only ever by routes Gui Chen's own training, bleeding, unbidden, into her instincts more with each passing week, seemed to choose for her before she'd consciously decided anything at all. She told herself, the first time, that she only meant to look. That standing across the street from the apartment she'd grown up in, watching lamplight move behind curtains she knew by heart, would be enough to settle whatever ache had been building in her chest since the funeral broadcast. It wasn't enough. It was never enough, and by the 4th week she had stopped pretending otherwise, even to herself. She found the fire escape she'd used as a teenager sneaking back in past curfew, tested whether Gui Chen's larger frame could still fit through the gap in the rear gate, and let herself, one humid evening, climb close enough to the kitchen window to hear her parents' voices through the screen without being seen. Her mother was cooking, the specific rhythm of a cleaver against a cutting board that Su Qingran could have picked out of 1,000 other kitchens blindfolded, and her father sat at the table nearby, reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair, going through what looked like old photographs. She would have hated all this attention, her mother said, not looking up from the cutting board, voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had cried enough in the preceding weeks to run temporarily out of tears. The Memorial Fund. The scholarship in her name. She always said journalists should be invisible. Let the story be the story. She'd have written an article about the Memorial Fund itself, her father said, and something in his voice cracked at the edges of what was almost a laugh. Found some angle nobody else noticed. Some contradiction buried in the paperwork. Su Qingran, crouched in the dark 2 floors below her own childhood window, pressed a stranger's hand hard against her mouth to keep the sound of her own breaking from carrying through the screen. Ruashi has been such a comfort, her mother continued, setting down the cleaver, wiping her hands on a towel that had hung on the same hook for as long as Su Qingran could remember. I don't know how we would have managed without her these past weeks. It's like having a piece of Qingran still with us. The words landed with a violence Su Qingran hadn't braced for. She understood, crouched in the dark listening to her own mother find comfort in the presence of the woman who had helped orchestrate her supposed death, that this was perhaps the cruelest part of the entire conspiracy, not the danger to herself, not even the ruin of Gui Chen's name, but this, 2 people who loved her completely, grieving a version of loss that was itself an elaborate lie, finding solace in the very person responsible for their grief. She did not go inside. She told herself it was for their safety, that revealing anything now, before Lu Qinghan was exposed, would only place them directly in danger's path, and that was true, as far as it went. But sitting on the fire escape afterward, back against the cool brick, listening to the ordinary sounds of a home she could no longer safely enter, she understood there was a second truth beneath the first. She did not yet know how to explain to 2 grieving parents that their daughter's face now belonged to someone who had helped murder her, and that their daughter herself was alive, watching from the shadows, wearing the face of a man the whole world called a monster. She returned to that fire escape 11 more times over the following months, never announcing herself, never risking more than the sound of her own breathing in the dark, until, near the very end, she finally worked up the courage to leave something behind, a single sprig of the white jasmine her mother had always kept on the windowsill, left quietly on the ledge with no note, no explanation, nothing but the small, private hope that some part of her mother might recognize the gesture for what it was, without ever needing to understand why. She didn't sleep after that message. She sat at Gui Chen's desk until the sky outside turned the color of dishwater, going through drive after drive, and by the time morning came she had stopped thinking of the man whose body she wore as a monster. She had started, uneasily, to think of him as someone she owed an apology to. The drives told a story in fragments, voice memos recorded late at night, financial trails annotated in the margins with a precision that bordered on obsessive, and one folder, buried 3 layers deep behind a password that took her 2 days to guess, containing files about a family. His family. A father, a mother, a younger sister, all three names crossed through in the same careful red pen, all three death certificates dated within 11 months of each other 6 years earlier. Accidents, the coroner's report said. A car that failed to brake on a dry road. A gas leak in an apartment inspected and cleared only weeks before. A drowning in water 3 feet deep. Su Qingran had read enough coroner's reports in her career to recognize when 3 accidents formed a pattern too neat to be accidental. She listened to one of the voice memos twice before she understood it was Gui Chen's own voice, recorded alone, months before the warehouse, flat, controlled, the voice of a man rationing his own grief because there was no one left to spend it on. They took my family because my father wouldn't sign the merger, the recording said. I will not let them take anyone else. She thought of every warning he had given her outside her apartment, outside the parking garage, warnings she had recorded as threats, published as evidence of his menace, worn like a badge of journalistic courage. Stop before it stops you. Not a threat. A confession of fear, badly disguised as one, from a man who had already watched 3 people he loved be erased for asking the wrong questions. She went back to the warehouse footage next. A security feed Gui Chen had apparently rerouted and archived without his own employer's knowledge, timestamped the night of her death. She made herself watch it in full for the first time since waking in his body. It rewrote everything. On the recording, Gui Chen didn't lead the gunman to her. He arrived after them, breathless, clearly having tracked their movements through channels only someone inside Helios could access. She watched him shove her sideways as the first shots came, watched the impact take him instead of her, watched him surge back to his feet with blood already darkening his shirt to physically block the second line of fire with his own body. She watched, frame by frame, the sniper positioned on the upper catwalk, a 4th shooter, uncounted in any official report, wearing a Helios-issue tactical harness that matched nothing worn by Gui Chen's own security detail. She watched the fatal shot come from that 4th shooter's position. Not from Gui Chen. Never from Gui Chen. She watched him drop to his knees beside her dying body, hands shaking, and pull something from an inside pocket, a slim silver device she recognized, with growing horror, from an earlier folder labeled Helios Labs, Neural Continuity Program. She watched him press it to both their throats in the same desperate motion, whispering words the audio couldn't fully capture but that she could now, chillingly, half-read from the shape of his mouth. Please. Not both of us. Not like this. An experimental device. A last, desperate gamble by a man who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what Helios Consortium's laboratories had been quietly perfecting for years, and who had used it not as a weapon, but as a final act of mercy for a woman he had failed to save any other way. Neither of them, she understood now, staring at the frozen frame of his blood-streaked face bent over her body, could have predicted what the device would actually do. Not simply preserve a dying woman's life, exchange something far stranger. Consciousness itself, thrown loose from 2 collapsing bodies and caught, however imperfectly, in whatever vessel remained. She sat back from the screen, Gui Chen's barred hands pressed hard against her mouth, and understood with sick, complete clarity that the man the entire city believed had murdered her had instead spent the last moments of his freedom trying to save her life, at the cost of everything he had left. One name recurred throughout the files often enough that Su Qingran eventually recognized it as more than a data point, a contact Gui Chen had cultivated for over a year, identified only by the codename Sparrow, whose information had formed the backbone of nearly everything he'd compiled against Helios. She found the meeting protocol buried in his notes, a specific bench in a specific park, always at dusk, always with a particular newspaper folded in a particular way as signal. She almost didn't go, every instinct honed by weeks of hiding screened against deliberately exposing herself in a public park as a man half the city was hunting, but the file suggested Sparrow held information about the continuity program's origins that existed nowhere else, and she had run out of other doors to try. Sparrow turned out to be a mid-level engineer from Helios Labs named Wen Jiasen, younger than Su Qingran had expected, with the particular exhausted wariness of someone who had spent a year deciding, piece by piece, that her conscience mattered more than her career. She nearly bolted the instant she recognized Gui Chen's face approaching the bench, and only stayed, hands white-knuckled around her coat, once Su Qingran said the one thing she suspected might actually be believed. I'm not the man you've been sending information to, she said quietly, sitting at the opposite end of the bench, not looking directly at her. Not exactly. I need you to trust me anyway, because he's not coming back to finish what you two started, and I am. When Jason studied her for a long, silent moment, and something in her expression, grief, perhaps, or simple recognition of a desperation that matched her own, seemed to settle the question for her. I helped design the neural interface for the continuity units, she said finally, voice barely above the evening traffic noise. I didn't understand what it was actually for until 18 months in. By then I had a mortgage and a sister depending on my salary, and I told myself I'd find a way to fix it quietly, from the inside, before anyone got hurt. Her laugh was short and bitter. I was very wrong about the timeline. She handed over, that evening, a final piece Su Qingran hadn't found anywhere in Gui Chen's own files, internal Helios board minutes proving Lu Qinghan had personally authorized the program's use as what one memo chillingly termed asset continuity in the event of terminal liability, a euphemism, when Jason explained, for using the device not just on dying executives but on anyone whose death might otherwise expose the company to serious legal consequence. Su Qingran was supposed to simply die that night, when Jessen said, rising to leave, pulling her coat tighter against the evening chill. The device wasn't meant to save her. It was authorized for Gui Chen, in case things went wrong for him during the operation, insurance for their own security director, not mercy for a journalist he was supposedly sent to eliminate. Whatever actually happened out there, it wasn't according to anyone's plan. Not Lu Qinghan's. Not even, I think, Gui Chen's own superiors. She left Su Qingran alone on the bench with that thought settling slowly into place, that the machine built to protect powerful men from consequence had been turned, in its one unscripted moment, into an act of sacrifice instead, by a man everyone had trained themselves to see only as a weapon. She had built her career exposing men who hid behind masks of respectability while doing unforgivable things. She had never once considered that a man could wear a mask of monstrousness while doing something close to heroic, and that she, of all people, the reporter who prided herself on seeing past every carefully constructed lie, had been the one who believed the mask completely. The graves. She found the cemetery listed in one of the older files, an address circled in red ink so many times the paper had nearly worn through, and she went there alone on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a coat collar pulled high against a wind that smelled like rain that never quite arrived. 3 headstones stood together beneath a cypress tree at the edge of the family plot, a father, a mother, a younger sister who had been, according to the file, only 19 when the water in a bathtub 3 feet deep had somehow been enough to end her. Su Qingran stood in front of them for a long time in a stranger's body, uncertain whether she had any right to grieve people she had never met, in a voice that wasn't hers, over a loss that belonged entirely to someone else. She found, standing there, that she grieved them anyway. Not as Su Qingran, she hadn't known them, would never have known them, if the warehouse hadn't happened. She grieved them the way Gui Chen must have grieved them 1,000 quiet times in 6 years of building a case no one else believed needed building, alone, unable to trust even the people paid to protect him. She listened to the last of his voice memos sitting on the cold ground in front of his sister's grave, headphones in, rain finally beginning to fall in a fine, cold mist. It was dated the night before the warehouse. If this works, his recorded voice said, low and steady in a way that betrayed, underneath the control, something close to fear, I don't know what it will cost. I don't know if there's a version of this where I get to explain myself to anyone. But I would rather disappear having tried to save her than survive having let another person become a name on a stone I visit alone. She sat with that until the rain soaked through the shoulders of his coat, until the cold reached all the way to whatever remained, underneath the borrowed body, of who she still was. She thought about the parking garage, the warning she'd recorded as threats, the 6 years of grief he'd carried entirely by himself because trusting anyone, even briefly, had only ever gotten the people he loved killed. She understood, sitting there, that something in her had shifted in a way she wasn't fully prepared to name. It wasn't simple. She had spent weeks living inside skin that wasn't hers, learning a stranger's silences until they no longer felt foreign, reading his most private grief until it had become, in some unwilling way, part of her own. She did not know, and suspected she might never know, where the line still ran between admiring a man she had wronged and loving one she had never properly met, whether what she felt now belonged to her, or to some fading trace of him still folded into the body they now, impossibly, shared. It frightened her more than the gunman had. She stood, finally, brushed the wet grass from a stranger's knees, and made herself a quiet promise at the foot of 3 graves that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with who she was becoming. I will finish what you started. Whatever it costs me. Grief, Su Qingran discovered, did not disappear simply because the person you were grieving turned out to be innocent. It just changed shape, curdled into something closer to fury, and pointed itself, finally, at the right target. She began watching Shinruwashi in earnest. It wasn't difficult to justify to herself. If Shinruwashi had somehow ended up inhabiting Su Qingran's body through the same device that had thrown Su Qingran into Gui Chen's, then understanding how, and why, mattered more than anything else in her life right now. What she found, over 10 days of careful, quiet surveillance, unsettled her more than the warehouse footage had. Shinruwashi was not merely surviving in her stolen life. She was managing it. Su Qingran watched, from a rented car 3 doors down, from a corner table in a cafe Shinruwashi favored for lunch, from behind a newspaper in the lobby of her own former apartment building, as Shinruwashi met, twice in 1 week, with 2 of the junior sources Su Qingran had spent months cultivating for the Helios story. She watched those sources leave the meetings agitated, watched one of them stop answering calls from the newspaper entirely within days. She watched a follow-up article Su Qingran had drafted. Ready to publish, quietly vanished from the paper's editorial queue under Shinruwashi's byline, replaced by a soft, unthreatening piece about corporate philanthropy that mentioned Helios Consortium's charitable foundation in glowing terms. She watched Shinruwashi sit across from Detective Han Zixuan in a downtown cafe and say, in a voice pitched perfectly for sympathy, that she was frightened Gui Chen might come looking for her next, that she'd heard he'd been seen near her apartment, that she didn't feel safe. Su Qingran, seated 2 tables away in Gui Chen's own body with a baseball cap pulled low, felt something cold settle into her stomach as she watched the detective's expression harden with fresh resolve. The net around Gui Chen, around her, was tightening, and Shinruwashi's hand was visibly on the rope. The confirmation came on a rain-heavy Thursday evening when Qingran followed Qingran to a private members club on the eastern edge of the financial district and watched, from behind a parked delivery van, as she was met at the entrance not by a friend or a colleague but by a black car she recognized immediately from the surveillance photographs in Gui Chen's files. Liu Qinghan's car. She circled to a service entrance, found a fire stair that led her onto a mezzanine overlooking the private dining room below, and crouched in the dark with a small parabolic microphone she'd taken, guiltily, from Gui Chen's equipment closet. The conversation below came through in fragments, warped by distance and the low music playing over the club speakers, but one sentence cut through clean enough to stop her breath entirely. Liu Qinghan, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been questioned by anyone who mattered, said it almost fondly, the way you'd praise a piece of good work. She never suspected you were beside her from the beginning. Qingran went very still. Not after. Not planted once things went wrong. From the beginning. Every piece rearranged itself in her mind with brutal, humiliating speed. Every source Qingran had helped her find over the past 2 years. Every editorial suggestion that had, in hindsight, softened her articles just enough to keep them from landing a fatal blow. Every late-night conversation where Qingran had confided her suspicions about Helios and watched her closest friend nod along, sympathetic, encouraging, feeding every fragment of information straight back to the man orchestrating the entire conspiracy. Qingran hadn't been her friend who happened to be manipulated. She had been planted there. Years ago. Patiently. Guiding every investigation exactly where Liu Qinghan wanted it to go, and quietly steering it away from anything that might have actually reached him. Qingran's hands, Gui Chen's hands, tightened white-knuckled on the mezzanine railing. Below, as if she'd felt the weight of the stair pressing down through the dark, Qingran lifted her head. Turned. Looked directly up at the shadowed mezzanine where Qingran crouched, unmoving, certain for one heart-stopping second that she'd been made. Qingran smiled. Not confused. Not alarmed. A slow, knowing curve of Qingran's own mouth, worn like a mask that fit far too comfortably, that told her, with perfect, chilling clarity, that Qingran had known exactly who was standing in Gui Chen's body from the very first night in that hospital room. The first time Liu Qinghan spoke to her directly, it was not at the Eastern Club, and it was not an ambush. It was, in its own way, far more unsettling, a handwritten note delivered by a private courier to Gui Chen's apartment, inviting Director Gu to a quiet dinner to discuss the board's concerns in a more civilized setting than the last session allowed. She nearly refused. Every instinct she'd inherited, borrowed, or built for herself over the preceding weeks screamed against walking voluntarily into a private meeting with the man she now understood, from Gui Chen's own files, to be responsible for the deaths of an entire family and very nearly her own. But refusing outright risked more suspicion than accepting carefully, and so she went, dressed in the careful, understated elegance she'd learned Gui Chen favored, to a private room in a restaurant 3 floors above the city she'd once covered as a reporter. Liu Qinghan was, in person, almost disappointingly ordinary, a trim, silver-templed man in his 60s with the easy, unhurried warmth of someone who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered and had long since stopped needing to prove it. He rose when she entered, extended a hand she made herself shake, and gestured her into the seat across from him with the practiced hospitality of a man hosting an old friend. Director Gu, he said, pouring tea himself rather than summoning a server, an intimacy she understood immediately as a kind of performance. You've had a difficult season. I wanted to see for myself how you were managing. I'm managing, she said, keeping her voice as flat and unreadable as she'd practiced for weeks in mirrors that no longer felt entirely foreign. Good. He studied her over the rim of his own cup, and something in the attention made the back of her neck prickle with the specific awareness of being examined by someone who had built an empire on knowing exactly which threads to pull. You've always been our most thorough director, Yi Chen. 6 years of loyal service. I confess I was surprised, when the reporter's death first came across my desk, to learn you'd been anywhere near that warehouse at all. It's not the kind of operation I would have expected to require your personal attention. She understood, with a chill that took considerable effort to keep from her face, that he was testing her, probing gently at the edges of a story he already half suspected didn't add up, watching for exactly the kind of hesitation that would confirm it. I go where the company's interests are threatened, she said, borrowing the flat authority she'd practiced in the boardroom, and watched something in Liu Qinghan's expression settle, not quite satisfied, but willing, for now, to let the answer stand. Of course, he said, smiling, refilling her cup without being asked. Loyalty like yours is rare, Yi Chen. I'd hate to see anything happen to it. The warmth in his voice never wavered. The threat underneath it was unmistakable all the same. Do let me know if there's anything further you need to put this unpleasant business fully behind you. I do so value continuity. She left the dinner 2 hours later with her composure intact and her hands shaking so badly, once she reached the privacy of the car, that she had to sit for 10 full minutes before she trusted herself to drive. It was the first time she understood, with her whole body rather than simply her intellect, exactly how thin the ice beneath her had become and exactly how closely Liu Qinghan had already begun to watch the man whose face she wore. 2 nights later, Qingran found her first. Su Qingran was leaving a late meeting with one of Gui Chen's few remaining contacts inside Helios's compliance division when a car pulled alongside her on a quiet street and the passenger window slid down to reveal her own face, calm and unhurried, studying her from the driver's seat. "Get in," Shinruwashi said, in a voice that used to comfort her through breakups and bad reviews and now made every hair on her arms rise. Before someone sees Gui Chen loitering on a street corner and calls it in. She got in. It felt, absurdly, like climbing into a car with a ghost wearing her own reflection. "You've been careless," Shinruwashi said once they were moving, eyes on the road, voice conversational in a way that made the words land harder. "The mezzanine. The cafe. You're not as invisible as you think, Su Qingran." Hearing her own name spoken by her own stolen mouth nearly undid her composure entirely. "How long have you known?" "Since the hospital." Shinruwashi's mouth curved, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "I felt you arrive. The way you'd feel a stranger walk into a room you thought was empty." "I don't think Gui Chen's mind went anywhere, exactly. I think it's still in there with you, somewhere underneath. That's usually how it works, when the transfer happens under duress. You get someone else's habits bleeding through. Their instincts. Maybe even their feelings, eventually, if you stay long enough." She glanced sideways, something unreadable flickering behind Su Qingran's own familiar eyes. "You should be careful what you let yourself feel for a dead man's body, by the way. It gets complicated." "You knew," Su Qingran said again, ignoring the observation because she wasn't ready to sit with it, "and you let my parents grieve a version of me that was never coming back. You let Han Zishuan build a case that would put an innocent man in prison. You let the world believe I was dead while you took everything I built." "I didn't take it," Shinruwashi said, and for the first time something genuine cracked through the composure, not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, worn thin by years of practice at not feeling things too deeply. "It was given to me. Before either of us understood what the device would actually do, there were people who decided I would need a landing place if things went wrong that night. I didn't choose your body, Su Qingran. I was assigned it. By Liu Qinghan." Shinruwashi's hands tightened fractionally on the wheel. "I'd be careful how loudly you say that name in a moving car," she said, and the warmth drained out of her voice entirely. "For both our sakes." She pulled over 3 blocks later, in front of nothing in particular, and waited in silence until Su Qingran understood she was meant to get out. At the door, she paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her own borrowed face wearing an expression she couldn't read at all. "For what it's worth," Shinruwashi said quietly, "I was your friend, once. Before all of this. I don't expect you to believe that. I'm not sure I believe it myself anymore." She looked away first, out through the windshield at the empty street. "Go home, Su Qingran. Whatever you're planning, it's bigger than either of us. You won't survive it." Su Qingran stood on the curb long after the car had pulled away, cold settling deep into a stranger's bones, and understood that whatever was left of their friendship had just delivered her, in its own broken way, both a threat and a warning, and that she had no idea, even now, which one to trust more. Detective Han Zishuan had built his career on a simple, stubborn principle: evidence didn't lie, even when everyone around it did. It was that principle, more than any sudden change of heart, that began quietly unraveling the case he'd built against Gui Chen in the weeks after the warehouse. The first thread came from the coroner's office, in a report he'd requested twice and been given, both times, with an unusual delay he chalked up initially to bureaucratic sluggishness. The angle of the fatal wound didn't match any weapon registered to Gui Chen or recovered at the scene. It matched, instead, a rifle round consistent with a sniper position on the warehouse's upper catwalk, a position no official account of the incident had ever placed a shooter. He sat with that discrepancy for 3 days before mentioning it to anyone, turning it over the way he turned over every piece of evidence that didn't fit cleanly into the story he already believed. He was not, by nature, a man who enjoyed being wrong. He was, however, a man who trusted a contradiction more than he trusted his own certainty, and this one refused to resolve no matter which way he turned it. The second thread came from an anonymous source, a courier, it turned out, that he only later connected to Su Qingran herself, who left a single flash drive taped beneath the windshield wiper of his unmarked car outside his own apartment building, no note, no explanation, containing 4 minutes of security footage from a Helios-owned camera that should, by every official account, have been destroyed in the same fire that consumed most of the warehouse's internal systems that night. He watched it 11 times before he allowed himself to believe what it showed. He did not confront Su Qingran, not yet, not directly, not in a way either of them could have safely survived if he'd guessed wrong. Instead, he did what he had always done best. He watched, quietly, patiently, cross-referencing every new fragment of evidence against the story he'd built, until the story built against Gui Chen collapsed under its own weight faster than any new story could be constructed to replace it. It was old Joe's first article, the one connecting 3 council members to Helios shell accounts, that finally forced his hand. He read it twice at his desk, then a third time standing in the break room with his coffee going cold, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a career built on one version of the truth suddenly requiring another, that he had spent months hunting the wrong man for the right crime. He didn't call Su Qingran directly. He left, instead, a message with a contact number scrawled on the back of a parking citation, tucked under the wiper of Gui Chen's own car outside a restaurant she'd been careless enough to visit twice in 1 week, a message with only 4 words on it, and a phone number beneath them. I believe you. Call. She called 2 nights later, voice guarded, refusing to meet anywhere he could easily arrange backup, and for nearly an hour they spoke in careful half-truths across a payphone line neither of them fully trusted, him testing the edges of what she knew, her testing whether his doubt was genuine or a trap dressed in sympathy. By the end of the call, neither of them had told the other everything. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, not quite trust, but the fragile beginning of it, built on the same stubborn principle Han Zixuan had built his entire career on. Evidence didn't lie. Even when almost everyone around it did. In the days after the mezzanine, the story of Gui Chen's supposed resurgence began, for the first time, to fracture into competing versions, and Su Qingran, watching from the careful distance of a man the public still believed capable of anything, found herself in the strange position of observing her own myth take on a life independent of anything she actually did. One faction of the coverage remained exactly what she'd expected, furious editorials demanding his immediate arrest, anonymous tip lines flooded with sightings real and imagined, a particularly vicious opinion piece in a rival paper that used words like predator and unrepentant without a shred of new evidence to support either. She read every one of them in the sleepless hours after midnight, and found, uncomfortably, that she recognized the rhetoric. It was, almost word for word, the same righteous certainty she herself had once brought to her own reporting on him. But a second faction had begun, slowly, to emerge alongside the first, smaller, quieter, easy to miss beneath the latter outrage, but unmistakably present once she started looking for it. A handful of independent bloggers noting the coroner's report inconsistencies Han Zixuan had quietly leaked, unattributed, to anyone willing to look closely. A true crime forum thread, 300 replies deep, picking apart the official timeline with the same obsessive rigor she'd once brought to her own investigations, arriving, piece by piece, at conclusions uncomfortably close to the truth. A single, brave op-ed from a retired judge questioning why no official explanation had ever accounted for the 4th shooter's tactical harness recovered at the scene. It wasn't enough, on its own, to change the official record. But it was enough to plant doubt in exactly the soil old Joe's forthcoming articles would need to take root, and Su Qingran understood, watching the city's opinion of Gui Chen begin its slow, uneven fracture, that the ground was finally shifting beneath Lu Qinghan's feet, not because of anything dramatic, but because enough ordinary people had simply refused to stop asking questions the official story couldn't answer. Su Qingran didn't go home that night. She drove Gui Chen's car in wide, aimless circles through the wet streets until dawn, replaying the smile, the sentence, the years of friendship that had apparently never existed at all, until the rage burned itself down into something colder and far more useful. If she could not trust her own memories of the people closest to her, she would trust only what she could verify, and for that, she needed to understand exactly what Lu Qinghan had built, and how far it reached. She returned to Gui Chen's files with new eyes. What she had read before as a corporate fraud case, she now read as a machine designed for something far larger. Helios Consortium's public face was a portfolio of energy infrastructure and logistics companies, respectable, unremarkable, the kind of conglomerate that sponsored museum wings and university scholarships. Its private structure, mapped out across 6 years of Gui Chen's obsessive documentation, was something closer to a shadow government, judges on quiet retainer, 3 city council members whose campaigns had been funded through untraceable shells, a private security division that did not appear on any public organizational chart and answered, as far as she could tell, to Lu Qinghan alone. And buried at the center of it, in a subfolder Gui Chen had labeled simply continuity, was the research program that had, however accidentally, saved her life. Helios Labs had not built the neural synchronization device to save anyone. The files described a project intended for something far colder, a contingency system, developed in secret, meant to let a small circle of Helios's most valuable executives transfer into younger, healthier, less legally encumbered bodies in the event of terminal illness or, more troublingly, criminal exposure. Lu Qinghan, the files suggested, had personally overseen its funding for the better part of a decade. She sat with that for a long time. Gui Chen had not stolen the device that saved her. He'd taken it from a lab that had built it for men like Lu Qinghan to escape consequence entirely, and in the chaos of the warehouse, dying himself, he had used it instead to try to save a reporter he barely knew, at the cost of his own body, his own name, and very possibly his own freedom. She understood, reading the last of the files as the sun came up over the financial district, that Shinrawashi's placement inside her own body was not incidental to that program either. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed, to be an accident of the device's malfunction. Somewhere in the folder's metadata, buried in a maintenance log dated the same week as the warehouse ambush, was a technician's note authorizing a secondary continuity transfer, subject, Urshan. Someone at Helios had known the device would be deployed that night. Someone had prepared a landing spot for Shinrawashi in advance. It meant the warehouse hadn't only been a trap for Su Qingran and Gui Chen. It had been an execution and a harvest at once, eliminate the reporter closing in on the truth, eliminate the security director who had turned against them, and install a loyal asset directly inside the dead woman's life to manage the fallout, all in a single night, all traceable back to nothing. It was, Su Qingran thought, sitting alone in Gui Chen's cold apartment with the first gray light of morning on her borrowed hands, the most thoroughly evil piece of engineering she had ever encountered, and she had spent 4 years writing about corporate cruelty for a living. Auntie Wei never asked directly, in all the months that followed, why the young master she had known for over a decade had grown gentler in ways she couldn't quite name, thanking her for groceries he had once accepted in silence, remembering, unprompted, the anniversary of a granddaughter's birthday she'd mentioned only once, years earlier, in passing. But Su Qingran suspected, watching the older woman's wary caution slowly soften into something closer to quiet trust, that she had noticed everything, and simply chosen, in her own careful way, not to ask questions she wasn't certain she wanted answered. The truth came out anyway, 3 weeks before the confrontation at the club, on an evening when Su Qingran came home later than usual, favoring a shoulder she'd bruised badly during a narrow escape from a Helios security patrol near the northern annex, and found Auntie Wei still in the kitchen, waiting with a look that made further pretense impossible. "You're not him," Auntie Wei said quietly, setting down the tea she'd been preparing, studying Su Qingran's face, Gui Chen's face, with an attention too careful to be anything but deliberate. "You move like him, mostly. You've learned his habits well. But I raised that boy from the time he could barely see over this counter, and I know the shape of his silences. Yours are different. Kinder, somehow, and sadder in a different place." Su Qingran sat down slowly at the kitchen table, too exhausted and too relieved to keep pretending, and told her, not everything, not the parts that would put her in danger simply for knowing them, but enough. Enough for Auntie Wei to understand that the young master she'd raised had, in his final act of freedom, done something extraordinary, and that the person now living in his place intended to honor it rather than simply hide behind it. Auntie Wei listened in silence, hands folded in her lap, and when Su Qingran finished, she rose without a word, crossed the kitchen, and set a second cup of tea down in front of her with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. "He would have wanted someone to finish what he started," she said finally, settling back into her chair. "He never said so directly, he wasn't a boy who said such things directly, even as a child, but I watched him work himself half to death for 6 years chasing people who'd already taken everything from him, and I always feared he'd die before he ever let anyone help him carry it." She studied Su Qingran for a long moment, something unexpectedly gentle settling into her weathered face. "I don't fully understand what happened to either of you in that warehouse. I'm not certain I want to. But I know kindness when I see it wearing a familiar face, and I have decided I would rather help you than lose another person to that family's grief." It was, in its own understated way, the first unconditional loyalty Su Qingran had been offered since waking in Gui Chen's body, and she found, driving nowhere in particular later that night simply to have somewhere to sit with the feeling, that it steadied something in her more thoroughly than any piece of evidence she'd uncovered in weeks of investigation. 2 nights later, against every instinct that had kept her alive so far, she went looking for the physical site itself, a Helios research annex on the city's northern industrial fringe that appeared in Gui Chen's files only as a set of coordinates and a single cryptic note, continuity, do not approach alone. She went alone anyway, because there was no one left she could bring who wouldn't either arrest her on sight or report the sighting straight back to the people she was trying to expose. The annex looked, from the outside, like nothing at all, a squat gray building behind a chain-link fence, indistinguishable from a dozen other logistics warehouses along the same stretch of road. It was the inside that told the truth. She used a keycard lifted from Gui Chen's own desk drawer, half expecting it to be deactivated, and felt something cold settle in her chest when the door clicked open without protest. The lab beyond was mostly stripped bare evidence, she realized, of a hurried cleanup in the weeks since the warehouse, someone at Helios already anticipating exposure and racing to erase what they could. But in a locked cabinet at the back of what had once clearly been a surgical suite, she found 3 more of the slim silver devices Gui Chen had used on the warehouse floor, each one labeled with a case number and, chillingly, a name. 2 of the names belonged to Helios board members she recognized from the emergency session she'd sat through days earlier, men in their 70s, men whose obituaries, she now understood with a nauseated clarity, had likely already been drafted somewhere in this building, waiting only for a body young enough and disposable enough to receive them. The 3rd name was Liu Chenghan's own. She was still photographing the cabinet's contents with a phone she'd have to destroy before morning when she heard the door at the far end of the corridor open, and froze. Voices. 2 men, moving unhurried through the building the way people moved through a space they owned and had no reason to fear. She had perhaps 90 seconds before whoever it was reached the surgical suite, and no route out that didn't cross directly into their path. She killed the phone's light, slid into the narrow gap behind a bank of dormant equipment, and made herself as still and small as a body built for 6-foot menace could manage. The footsteps grew closer. She recognized, through the thin wall, one of the voices as Deputy Director Fong's the smooth, watchful board proxy, who had said nothing at all during her boardroom performance days earlier and had, apparently, been watching more closely than she'd realized. The northern annex should have been cleared last week, Fong was saying, irritation sharpening his usual smoothness. If Director Kai finds a single device left in that cabinet, it's both our names on the disposal order. It'll be gone by Friday, the second voice answered. Chairman Liu wants the last unit kept until he's certain the reporter's replacement is fully secured. Insurance, in case Shinruashi's usefulness runs out. Fong's laugh was thin and humorless. She's already asking questions she shouldn't. If Gui Chen really is dead the way we assumed, someone else is asking them for him. They passed within 4 feet of where she crouched, close enough that she could smell Fawn's cologne, and moved on without pausing, their voices fading down a second corridor toward what she assumed was the cabinet in question. She counted 60 full seconds after the last footstep faded before she allowed herself to breathe normally again, and another 30 before her legs remembered how to carry her back out through the door she'd come in. She didn't stop shaking until she was 3 miles away, parked in a grocery store lot with the engine off, staring at photographs on her phone that confirmed everything and proved, with sickening clarity, that whatever plan she built now would have to move faster than Friday. It was in the days that followed the lab, more than any moment before it, that Su Qingran began to understand how thoroughly the last months had reshaped her. She had built her career on the belief that the truth, once exposed, was its own kind of justice, that if you simply showed people clearly enough what powerful men had done, the world would find some way to hold them accountable. She had never, in 4 years of reporting, broken into a locked facility, hidden in the dark listening to men discuss disposing of bodies like inventory, or planned, as she was now planning, sketching timelines on the back of one of Gui Chen's old case files, an operation that would require deceit, exposure, and considerable personal risk in service of a truth no court had yet agreed to hear. She caught her reflection once, late that week, in the darkened window of Gui Chen's office, and for a strange, vertiginous moment could not have said with certainty whether the steadiness looking back at her belonged to the reporter she had been or the man whose face she wore. She thought of Shinrawashi's warning in the car, "You should be careful what you let yourself feel for a dead man's body," and found she no longer had any honest answer to give it. She did not know, and had stopped trying to fully untangle, whether the fierce, protective anger she now carried toward Gui Chen's ruined name was born purely of guilt for the article that had helped ruin it, or of something else entirely, some quieter, more dangerous feeling that had crept in during long nights spent reading a stranger's grief until it no longer felt entirely like reading someone else's. She only knew that somewhere in the last month, the man she had once been prepared to expose as a monster had become, without her fully choosing it, someone she was no longer willing to let the world misremember. She thought of Detective Han Zixuan, still convinced Gui Chen was a killer, still one signature away from an arrest warrant that would end whatever chance they had of exposing any of this. She thought of Shinrawashi's smile on the mezzanine, confident and unafraid, because why would she be afraid of a truth no one would ever believe? She thought of her parents, comforted nightly by a woman who was not their daughter, mourning a version of events that was itself a lie built on top of a lie. And she thought, with a clarity that steadied her hands for the first time in weeks, that the only way out of this was not to hide from the reputation the world had already given her. It was to use it. It happened first in small ways, easy to dismiss as adrenaline or exhaustion or simple imitation grown too practiced to notice anymore. Her hand reaching, unbidden, for a particular drawer in Gui Chen's desk before she consciously remembered what it held. A phrase forming in her mouth in a cadence that wasn't quite her own. The way her chest tightened, sharp and unexplainable, whenever she passed the framed photograph on the mantle of a man, a woman, and a laughing teenage girl she had never met in life and grieved anyway, every single day, as though the grief itself had been waiting inside the body for her to finally arrive and give it somewhere to go. She mentioned none of it to anyone, not even Han Zixuan, in whom she had begun, cautiously, to place more trust than she'd placed in another living person since the warehouse. It felt too fragile, too easily misunderstood, to survive being spoken aloud, the growing suspicion that Gui Chen had not simply vanished the night the device took his body and gave it to her. That some fragment of him remained, folded into instinct and memory and the particular ache behind her ribs whenever she stood too long at that window overlooking the skyline he'd once watched alone. It came to a head on a night 3 weeks before the confrontation at the club, in the quiet after she'd finally cracked the last of the encrypted files and understood, in full, exactly what the continuity program had done to both of them. She sat alone in his study long after midnight, the desk lamp throwing a small circle of warm light against the surrounding dark, and found herself speaking aloud to an apartment she'd long since stopped believing was entirely empty. "I know you're in here somewhere," she said, feeling foolish, saying it anyway. "I don't know what that means. I don't know if you can hear me, or if this is just grief wearing a stranger's voice. But I wanted you to know, I understand now. What you did. What it cost you. I'm sorry I called you a monster in print. I'm sorry it took almost dying to see past the mask you built to survive." The apartment gave her nothing back but silence and the distant hum of the city below. She almost laughed at herself, reaching for the desk lamp to switch it off and go to bed, when her hand, Gui Chen's hand, the one that had learned, over 6 years, to move first and explain itself later, stopped an inch from the switch and simply held still, trembling faintly, as though it belonged, for one suspended moment, to someone else entirely. "I know," something in her thought, in a voice she couldn't fully separate from her own, worn thin and exhausted and, impossibly, grateful. "Thank you for finishing it." She sat in the dark for a long time afterward, uncertain whether she had imagined the entire exchange, uncertain whether it mattered either way. What she knew, with a clarity that startled her more than the moment itself, was that whatever she felt now for the man whose body she wore, whose grief she had inherited, whose 6 years of solitary sacrifice she had spent the last month piecing back together, it was no longer simply guilt, and it was no longer simply admiration for a stranger's courage. It had become something she recognized, uneasily, as love, complicated, impossible, folded into a body and a name that had never belonged to her, for a man she might never fully get to meet in any way that made sense to the rest of the world. She did not know what to do with that. She only knew, sitting alone in the dark of his study with her hand, now, in whatever way that word could still mean anything, resting against the cool metal of a desk lamp switch, that she was no longer entirely certain where he ended and she began, and that some nights, lately, she had stopped minding. The plan, when it finally came together, terrified her. If Gui Chen was already believed to be a violent, unpredictable man capable of anything, then every resource the police were pouring into hunting him, every officer watching his known associates, every alert flagged on his accounts, every reporter, God, the irony of it, staking out his last known locations, could be turned, carefully, into cover for exactly the kind of operation Su Qingran needed to run. She stopped hiding. She let herself be seen, briefly, deliberately, always vanishing before anyone could close the distance, near two of the shell companies Gui Chen's files had traced back to Helios. She let sightings leak. She let the story grow, the way she once would have grown a story herself. A whisper here, a blurry photograph there, until the narrative took on a life independent of anything she actually did. Gui Chen has resurfaced. Gui Chen is planning something. Every appearance further destroyed whatever remained of his reputation. And underneath every staged sighting, she was doing something else entirely, feeding, one careful anonymous package at a time, the financial evidence Gui Chen had spent 6 years compiling to the one journalist at her own paper she knew could not be bought, threatened, or quietly redirected, a stubborn, unglamorous investigative editor named Old Joe, who had trained her when she was 23 and had never once, in her memory, backed down from a fight. She watched, from a careful distance, as the story began to move without her, as Old Joe's byline appeared beneath the first article connecting 3 city council members to Helios shell accounts, as the follow-up traced the neural continuity program's funding directly to Liu Qinghan's personal office. Each article further destabilized the very foundation Shinruashi had spent weeks trying to protect. Each one brought Detective Han Zixuan a step further from the tidy story he'd been handed and a step closer to a set of questions no one in his department wanted him to ask. Gui Chen's ruined name was the price of it, and she paid it without hesitation, because she understood by then, with a certainty that had nothing to do with the danger they were both in, that the man whose face she wore had already paid a far higher price for a version of the same fight, and paid it silently, for 6 years, while she called him a monster in print. She met Old Joe only once during those weeks, in person, in the cramped back booth of a noodle shop he'd favored since before Su Qingran had joined the paper, a meeting arranged through 3 intermediaries and a level of caution that would have seemed absurd to her only months earlier, back when the worst danger she imagined facing was a strongly worded cease and desist letter. He didn't recognize her, of course, how could he, looking at Gui Chen's face across a table of cold noodles, until she said the one thing only her old mentor would understand, a private joke about his terrible handwriting that she'd complained about in 100 late-night editing sessions, one she'd never told another living soul. Old Joe set down his chopsticks very slowly. That's not possible, he said, and then, studying the particular stubborn set of her jaw, the same one he'd spent 3 years training out of her prose and never quite succeeded, added, quieter, Qingran? She told him everything, because there was no version of the plan that worked without someone at the paper who could run the story without flinching, and because some stubborn, exhausted part of her simply needed, after months of lying to everyone she passed on the street, to tell one person the entire truth and be believed without having to fight for it. Old Joe listened without interrupting, the way he'd always listened to her pitch meetings, and when she finished, he sat back in the booth and exhaled slowly through his nose. You always did find a way to make my job harder, he said, which from him, she knew, was close to the warmest thing he was capable of saying. Send me everything you have. I'll run it exactly the way you would have run it. No softening for anyone's comfort, including yours. He kept that promise precisely. Every article that followed carried his byline and, in the phrasing, cadence, and stubborn refusal to bury the lead, unmistakably hers as well, the last collaboration of a partnership neither of them had expected to survive her own supposed death, built now on a lie about her survival that was, in its own strange way, the truest thing either of them had published all year. The final confrontation came faster than she expected, and not on ground she had chosen. Liu Qinghan requested, no, summoned, a private meeting at the same Eastern club where she'd overheard Shinruashi weeks earlier, and made it clear through an intermediary that Gui Chen's associate would be wise to attend alone. She understood it for what it was, an invitation to be silenced quietly, away from cameras, in a room full of Liu Qinghan's own people. She went anyway. She did not go alone. Detective Han Zixuan, whom she had finally, terrifyingly, decided to trust with a single carefully redacted piece of the surveillance footage 3 days earlier, arrived with 2 plainclothes officers positioned outside the club before the meeting began, enough contradiction in Gui Chen's file, enough of Old Joe's published evidence, that even a man who had built his career believing Gui Chen guilty could no longer ignore what didn't add up. And Shinruashi, summoned to the same room by Liu Qinghan himself to manage the situation, arrived already unraveling, having spent the past week watching her own carefully built position crumble beneath the weight of Old Joe's reporting. Liu Qinghan, seated at the head of the private dining room with the same easy confidence Su Qingran remembered from the mezzanine, did not deny anything when confronted. He seemed, if anything, almost pleased to finally say it aloud to the people he'd spent years managing from the shadows. You want a confession, he said, swirling wine he had not yet touched, studying her, studying Gui Chen's face, with something that might, in another life, have passed for respect. Fine. I orchestrated the warehouse. I funded the continuity program because men like me should not have to answer for decisions made decades ago simply because a body grows old and inconvenient. And I considered you and the reporter the same problem, requiring the same solution. He finally sipped the wine, unhurried, as though the admission cost him nothing at all. The only miscalculation was assuming the device would kill you both cleanly instead of doing whatever it is you managed to survive into. That, I'll admit, I did not plan for. You planned for everything else, Su Qingran said, and heard, beneath Gui Chen's low voice, something that was entirely her own fury finally given room to speak. 3 council members. A dozen shell companies. A lab built to let men like you outlive the consequences of what they've done to the rest of us. She set a thin folder on the table between them, copies, not originals, the originals already safe in old Joe's hands, and 3 separate off-site drives Han Zixuan didn't yet know existed. It's already published, Chairman Liu. Every page of it. You didn't lose to me tonight. You lost 3 days ago, when the first article ran, and you've simply been too busy congratulating yourself to notice. For the first time, something flickered behind Liu Qinghan's composure, not fear exactly, but the particular unease of a man realizing, a half-second too late, that the room he believed he controlled no longer belonged entirely to him. It was Shinruashi, in the end, who broke the room open. Standing in Su Qingran's own stolen body, hearing Liu Qinghan describe the woman whose face and life she had been living in for weeks as disposable, as easily replaced as the reporter she'd been planted to manage, something in her composure finally cracked. Su Qingran watched her own features twist with an emotion that looked, for the first time since the hospital, genuinely unguarded, not triumph, but fear. The realization, arriving years too late, that loyalty to a man like Liu Qinghan had never once been reciprocated, and never would be. Shinruashi turned on him. Not out of conscience, Su Qingran suspected she would never fully know, and had stopped needing to, but out of the oldest instinct there was, the will to survive when the ground finally shifted beneath her. What she handed Detective Han Zixuan in the next 10 minutes, recorded conversations and internal Helios communications she'd kept as insurance against exactly this moment, was enough to collapse whatever legal defense Liu Qinghan's decades of careful respectability had built around him. It was not, however, a clean surrender. Liu Qinghan's own security detail, 3 men positioned discreetly near the private room's second exit, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years learning to spot exactly this kind of arrangement moved the instant they understood the meeting had turned against their employer. Su Qingran saw it a half-second before Han Zixuan did, some instinct she couldn't fully claim as her own snapping her attention toward the shift in posture near the door. And she was already moving, shoulder low, when the first man reached for what turned out to be a concealed sidearm rather than a phone. The room dissolved into chaos. Shinruashi screamed and dropped behind an overturned chair with an instinct that looked, despite everything, genuinely frightened rather than performed. Han Zixuan's 2 plainclothes officers surged through the far door a half-second too late to prevent the first shot, which went wide, splintering the wood paneling above Liu Qinghan's own head, his own security detail, Su Qingran realized with grim clarity, no longer entirely certain whose survival they were actually protecting. She took the second man down herself, a move her body executed with a speed and precision that belonged, unmistakably, to 6 years of training she had never personally received, Gui Chen's instinct, surfacing exactly when she needed it most, guiding a stranger's hands through a fight she had no memory of ever learning. She felt him in that moment more clearly than she had in any file, any voice memo, any grave, not a ghost exactly, but a steadiness folded so deeply into the muscle and bone she now called her own that it answered when she couldn't. By the time the plainclothes officers moved in, the room had already turned. Liu Qinghan's icon of a business empire came apart not in a single dramatic blow but in the accumulated weight of everything Su Qingran, Gui Chen, Old Zhou, and, however belatedly, Shinruashi had each contributed to bringing down. The weeks that followed unfolded in the slow, exhausting rhythm of institutions catching up to a truth that had already happened. Liu Qinghan was arrested within the month, the first of what would become a sprawling prosecution touching 3 city council members, a dozen shell companies, and a research program that regulators would spend years trying to fully understand. Helios Consortium's stock collapsed. Its charitable foundation, once praised in glowing editorials, was dissolved amid revelations that its grants had quietly funded the very continuity program at the center of the scandal. Su Qingran attended the trial only once, seated near the back of a public gallery packed tighter than she'd ever seen a courtroom, wearing a face the entire city now recognized on sight and had, slowly, begun to regard with something closer to wary respect than fear. She watched Liu Qinghan across the room, smaller somehow in a prison-issue suit than he had ever seemed across a dinner table pouring tea with his own hands, and felt none of the triumph she might once have expected. What she felt instead, listening to prosecutors read into the record 6 years of quiet cruelty, the Gu family's accidents, the warehouse ambush, the continuity program's true purpose laid bare in board minutes when Jason had risked everything to preserve, was something closer to a grim, exhausted relief, the particular fatigue of a fight finally reaching its end after costing far more than anyone should have had to pay. When Jason testified on the 3rd day, hand steady despite everything, walking the court through the engineering of a device built to let powerful men escape consequence and turned, by one impossible night, into something its own designers had never intended. Detective Han Zixuan testified on the 5th, laying out with characteristic patience the evidentiary trail that had slowly, stubbornly, refused to support the story he himself had originally believed. Even Shinruashi testified, seated in the witness box in Su Qingran's own borrowed face, voice steady despite the visible toll of the preceding months, describing in careful, damning detail exactly how she had been placed, prepared, and deployed inside a dead woman's life. Liu Qinghan's own defense, when it finally came, amounted to little more than a series of technical objections and a closing statement that argued, with the same smooth confidence he'd once used to praise Gui Chen's loyalty over dinner, that a man of his stature could not reasonably be expected to personally oversee every detail of a sprawling corporation's operations. The jury did not find it persuasive. The verdict, when it came 6 weeks later, ran to 11 counts, and the sentence that followed ensured Liu Qinghan would not see the outside of a cell again in whatever years remained to him. Su Qingran left the courthouse that final day without speaking to any of the reporters gathered on the steps, old colleagues, some of them, people she had once shared byline credits and late-night deadline panic with, none of whom recognized in Gui Chen's careful, unreadable face the woman who had trained alongside them for years. She walked instead to a small park 3 blocks away, sat on a bench that reminded her, achingly, of the one where she'd first met Wen Jiasin, and allowed herself, for the first time since the warehouse, to simply cry not from grief this time, but from the strange, disorienting relief of an ending she had stopped fully believing she would live to see. There was no clean, tidy way to explain what had actually happened to Su Qingran and Gui Chen, and in the end, she chose not to try. The official record, carefully, deliberately incomplete, shaped by testimony she and Detective Han Zixuan agreed upon in a long, difficult conversation neither of them fully enjoyed, stated that Gui Chen had been an undercover asset working against Helios for years, that the warehouse ambush had been orchestrated by Liu Qinghan's people, and that Su Qingran, gravely wounded, had been saved through experimental medical intervention before going into hiding to protect the ongoing investigation. It wasn't true, not exactly. It was true enough for the world to accept, and true enough to let Gui Chen's ruined name begin slowly, the long work of repair. Their bodies could not be restored. The scientists Detective Han Zixuan quietly consulted, the handful who understood anything real about the continuity program before its labs were seized and shut down, were unanimous on that point, delivered with the particular gentleness reserved for news no amount of hope could soften. Whatever the device had done on that warehouse floor, it had done permanently. Su Qingran had expected, in the earliest days after learning that, to feel it as a second death. Instead, she found herself standing at the window of Gui Chen's apartment one evening months later, watching the city lights come on across a skyline she had once photographed for very different reasons, and feeling something closer to accept and settle into a body that no longer felt entirely borrowed. She chose, in the end, to keep living as Gui Chen not as a disguise, not any longer, but because somewhere in the unraveling of his files, his warnings, his 6 quiet years of grief turned into evidence, she had come to understand him more completely than she had ever understood anyone, including, if she was honest, herself. She began, carefully and publicly, the work of rebuilding a name the city had been taught to fear, cooperating with prosecutors, funding a modest legal foundation for whistleblowers in his name, giving one difficult, closely managed interview that let the public see, for the first time, the man beneath 6 years of manufactured menace. The interview ran nearly 40 minutes, conducted by a veteran anchor who had covered the original case and approached the request, initially, with open skepticism. Su Qingran sat across from her in a plain office borrowed from old Joe's paper, hands folded carefully in her lap the way she'd practiced for weeks, and answered questions she'd rehearsed until the rehearsed answers had, somewhere along the way, become entirely true. "Why speak now, after everything?" the anchor asked, near the end, leaning forward slightly. "You could have simply disappeared once the charges against Liu Qinghan were secured. No one would have blamed you for wanting to leave this name behind entirely." Su Qingran considered the question longer than the anchor likely expected, aware of the cameras, aware of the millions of people who would eventually watch this answer and decide, based on it, whether the man in front of them deserved even a fraction of the trust the city had once withheld so completely. "Because a great deal of harm gets done in this world by people who are never made to answer for it," she said finally, "and a great deal more gets done by the world simply refusing to look closely enough at the people it has already decided to hate. I spent 6 years being the second kind of harm to someone who deserved better. I don't think I get to walk away from that just because the truth finally came out. I think the least I owe him is to keep showing up." She paused, aware of how close the words came to the truth she could never fully explain. "So I'm staying. Not to be forgiven. Just to be honest, from now on, about who was actually standing in that warehouse, and what it cost him to be there." The clip circulated for weeks afterward, dissected in editorials and late-night panel discussions, praised by some as remarkable courage and dismissed by others as calculated public relations. Su Qingran read every response she could stomach and found, in the end, that she no longer needed the world's verdict to know which one was true. The foundation launched 3 months later, funding legal defense for whistleblowers facing exactly the kind of corporate retaliation that had once cost the Gu family everything, its first case taken up, fittingly, on behalf of a young Helios engineer named Wen Jiasin, whose own quiet courage had helped bring the entire conspiracy into the light. Shinruashi's fate remained the messiest thread of all. Her cooperation with prosecutors earned her a reduced sentence rather than a cell beside Liu Qinghan's, and Su Qingran, to her own surprise, found she could not summon the clean hatred she'd expected to feel. What she felt instead, visiting her once in the sterile visitation room of a minimum security facility, was something closer to grief for a friendship that had perhaps, in its earliest years before Liu Qinghan's influence, been real, and had simply been bent, slowly and deliberately, into something neither of them had chosen. Do you ever wonder, Shinruashi asked that day, seated across a scarred table in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner, wearing Su Qingran's own face thinner and grayer than it had ever been in life, which one of us actually died in that warehouse? Every day, Su Qingran admitted, and found it was the truest thing she'd said to anyone in months. I used to think I got the better trade, Shinruashi said, looking down at hands that weren't hers, twisting a hospital-issue bracelet around one wrist. Your life. Your parents, who never once looked at me and suspected anything wrong. Your career, handed to me fully built. She looked up, and something in her expression, for once, held no performance at all. I was wrong. You built all of it by staying exactly who you were, even when it cost you everything. I don't know how to be anyone, Su Qingran. I never did. I think that's the real reason Lu Qinghan chose me all those years ago. I was easy to point in any direction he wanted. Su Qingran didn't have an answer for that. She left the visitation room without one, and didn't return, though she made certain, quietly and without ever admitting it to anyone, that a portion of Gui Chen's rebuilt legal foundation funded Shinruashi's eventual appeal for early release on grounds of cooperation, not forgiveness, exactly, but something adjacent to it, offered to a woman who had, in the end, chosen to break with the only power that had ever shaped her. Her parents never learned the full truth. Su Qingran decided, after long, sleepless deliberation, that some truths cost more than they were worth, and let them go on believing their daughter had survived a terrible ordeal and simply needed time and privacy to heal, visiting them occasionally as a family friend, close enough to watch over them, far enough to protect the fragile peace they'd finally found. The story closed, in the end, not with a dramatic unmasking but with something quieter, a press conference, months later, held in a plain municipal briefing room too small for the number of reporters who crowded into it, cameras jostling for a clear line of sight to the podium where Detective Han Zixuan stood, notes in hand, visibly uncomfortable with the size of the room but unwilling, as always, to let discomfort stop him from saying exactly what the evidence required. The department's original conclusions regarding the Su Qingran case were incomplete, he said, reading carefully from a statement he had, Su Qingran knew, rewritten at least 6 times to satisfy both the department's legal counsel and his own stubborn insistence on accuracy. New evidence, developed over the course of a broader investigation into Helios Consortium, confirms that Gui Chen acted to protect Ms. Su during the warehouse incident rather than cause her harm, at considerable personal risk. Ms. Su survived her injuries and has cooperated extensively with this investigation from a position of protected anonymity for her own safety. Mr. Lu Qinghan and several associates now face charges related to conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder in connection with these events. The room erupted into questions the moment he finished, most of them variations on the same disbelieving theme: how, why, where is she now, will she ever speak publicly herself, and Han Zixuan fielded each one with the same patient, unhurried caution he'd once turned on Gui Chen in a hospital room, deflecting anything that might expose the parts of the truth the official record had agreed, carefully, to leave unspoken. Su Qingran watched the broadcast alone, from the same apartment window where she had first understood, months earlier, that the world believed her dead. She watched her own name spoken aloud on national television for the first time since her funeral, watched reporters who had once written her obituary now scrambling to update it into something closer to a resurrection, and felt, watching it all from a careful, permanent distance, something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief but some complicated country between the two that she suspected she would live in for the rest of whatever life came next. The city that had feared Gui Chen's face for years slowly, imperfectly, began to see past it. Strangers on the street still occasionally flinched at his silhouette in a doorway, still occasionally crossed to the far side of a crowded sidewalk without fully knowing why. Old fear, she learned, dies slower than the reputation that built it. But it was dying. Every month brought some small, hard-won evidence of it, a shop owner near the apartment who began greeting her by name instead of watching her warily from behind the register, a group of university students who recognized her at a cafe and, instead of recoiling, asked earnest, awkward questions about the Helios case that she answered as honestly as the sealed parts of the record allowed, a letter, forwarded through old Joe's office, from a stranger who had lost a parent to circumstances eerily similar to the Gu family's own accidents, thanking her, thanking him, for finally proving that some deaths written off as coincidence had never been coincidence at all. And Su Qingran, still wearing a name and a body that had never been hers, still carrying the weight of a truth almost no one would ever fully understand, found that she no longer flinched from the reflection in the window. The monster the world had feared had never been the real villain. And the woman who had spent her life chasing the truth had finally, impossibly, become part of the story she could never publish, the only one, in the end, that mattered. On the first anniversary of the warehouse, she went back to it alone. The building had been sealed off for most of the year as evidence, its rusted door finally reopened to the public only weeks earlier as part of a modest, unofficial memorial that no city agency had approved and no one had bothered to stop, flowers left along the outer wall by strangers who had followed the case in the news, small handwritten notes tucked between the boards, most of them addressed to a version of the story that was only half true and somehow, still, entirely sincere. She stood where she remembered falling, on concrete that had long since been power-washed clean of anything that might have proven what really happened there, and felt, for the first time since waking in a stranger's body, something that resembled peace rather than merely survival. She thought of Detective Han Zixuan, 2 floors up in a precinct across the city, still occasionally calling to ask questions about the parts of the file that never quite closed all the way. She thought of Shinrawashi, somewhere behind a wall she had chosen, in her own strange way to help build. She thought of old Joe, gruff and unimpressed as ever, already chasing the next thread of the Helios collapse with the same stubborn refusal to look away. That had once trained a 23-year-old reporter to do the same. And she thought, standing in the quiet of a place that had once meant only violence to her, of the man whose name she now carried forward into whatever life came next, not as a disguise, not as an apology, but as something closer to a promise kept. She did not know, even now, whether some fragment of Gui Chen still lived somewhere inside the choices she made in his body, in the steadiness she'd learned to borrow from his silences, in the particular way her chest still tightened, unbidden, every time she passed his family's photograph on the mantle of an apartment that had slowly, quietly, become her own. Perhaps it was only memory. Perhaps it was something the science would never fully explain. She had stopped needing it explained. What she knew, standing in the last of that evening's light with the city settling into its ordinary rhythms around her, was simple enough to carry without breaking under its weight. The man the world had feared had spent his last free moments trying to save a stranger's life at the cost of his own name, and the woman who had once condemned him in print now stood in his place, still telling the truth, still refusing to look away, only now, for the first time in either of their lives, not alone. She turned from the warehouse and walked back into the city, into a name that had once terrified her and now, somehow, felt entirely like home. 1 year and a day. She kept, in the top drawer of Gui Chen's desk, a single photograph she had never shown to anyone, not Hanzishuan, not old Joe, not even, in the end, Shinrawashi during the one visit she allowed herself. It was a printout from the security footage of the warehouse, the frame she had once made herself watch again and again to understand what had really happened. Gui Chen, blood-streaked and dying, kneeling over a woman he barely knew, pressing a stranger's mercy into her throat with hands that had already given up on saving himself. She had cropped it, eventually, close enough that it no longer showed the wound, the blood, the wreckage of the warehouse floor around them, close enough to show only his face, bent close to hers, caught in that last unguarded moment before everything changed for both of them. It was, she had come to think, the only true portrait that existed anywhere of the man beneath 6 years of manufactured menace, not the security director the board feared, not the killer the tabloids had condemned, but simply a man choosing, in the last seconds available to him, to be kind to a stranger who had spent months publicly calling him a monster. She still didn't fully understand what remained of him in the choices she made, the reflexes that guided her hand, the grief that surfaced unbidden at graves that weren't originally hers to mourn. She had stopped needing a clean answer. Some nights, standing at the window with the city lights spread out below her the way he must have once watched them alone, she let herself simply exist in the space between two lives that had collided and merged into something neither of them could have designed on their own, not quite Su Qingran anymore, not quite Gui Chen, but something new, forged in a warehouse neither of them had walked into expecting to survive. She closed the drawer, finally, on the anniversary that marked 1 year and 1 day since the warehouse, long enough, she decided, to stop counting the anniversary itself as a wound and start counting it, instead, as a beginning. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening rhythm, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had happened within it, and Su Qingran, still wearing his face, still carrying his name forward into whatever came next, still quietly, complicatedly in love with a man the world would never fully understand her to have loved at all, allowed herself, for the first time in over a year, to simply feel steady. Not healed. Not finished. Simply steady enough to keep going, one ordinary day after another, in a life that had cost everything and, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, still felt worth living.